interventions or questions or comments, and a debate rather than simply question and answer. Any comments on the presentations, any specific questions, but also, above all, ideas about where this leads, about things we might need to think about or do differently in the lead up to 2015. Thank you. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Rafaela Blanca, head-on household energy network. Reconnect with the energy issue, of course. It's lacking from the MDGs, from DFID policy on international development, and yet it is such a big part of the needs of people. And in an urban context, we heard about light in the streets, we heard about how much more money people pay for services in town, and people do need to cook, and cooking is a big expense for urban population.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nat Mason, Water Policy Programme, ODI. I just wanted to make a quick observation with regards to David's very comprehensive list of issues with the MDG data and Claire's wish list of information needs. I have just come from working on some country reports for the African Ministers' Council on Water in about 32 countries. And arising from that, I think that as well as looking at the quality of the data coming out of UNICEF, WHO, World Bank, we've also got to ask what the governments themselves say is the situation, because very often it differs quite remarkably. We compared in each of these countries the data from the JMP, the Joint Monitoring Programme, with the government data, and so often that government data was based essentially on saying how many facilities they have built and assuming that a certain number of people were therefore covered per facility. And there were remarkable differences in every single country between those. And if we're going to engage on that issue, I think it's often going to be a process of very careful negotiation, because they're pretty convinced that their figures are right and they don't want to use the JMP, the Joint Monitoring Programme data. I'm sure it's the case for other sectors.
Thank you very much, Nat. There was a question here and then one over there.
Thank you. I'm Hugh Wellman-Smith. I'm an independent researcher. I think it's striking, looking at the MDGs as they presently stand, how little regard they had to urbanisation. I think the authors have a picture in their minds of taking Equine Island as a child there, a largely rural country with a small capital where it didn't have any particular problems. Of course, even in Tanzania, that's no longer a fair description of that country, and it's not a fair description of those other countries. So that all the non-urban MDGs appear not to have had any regard to how you tackle those kind of problems in an urban context. The one urban MDG, which is about improving the lot of 100 million slum dwellers, is clearly, it's not very appropriately framed. But if you ask what's actually happened in round numbers, in 2000 there were about 2 billion people in urban areas, about 1 billion in slums. In 2015 there will be about 3 billion people in urban areas, of which about 2 billion will be in slums. So far from improving the lot of 100 million people, 1 billion people have been added to those living in slums. This is, it seems clear that these goals have had no relation to the reality of rapid urbanisation, the kind of conditions that are created in urban areas, or the kinds of solutions that are going to emerge in discussion. So I think it's a really important issue here, and I'm glad that ODI is taking it up, as to how to frame goals for the future, assuming that exercise will take place, which have much more regard to what's really happening in countries, and in particular to the urban dimension.
Thank you very much, Hugh. We go here and then we'll take one more question here and then go back to the panel and then do a second round.
Hi, I'm Kate Cooper. I work for the World Bank as an urban project manager for the last 10 years, so just some thoughts on what's been said from a sort of person in trenches or bowels or whatever metaphor you prefer. a lot of what David says is always rings very true from someone inside one of these organizations, but I think that there are some promising developments, and talking to Claire's point, I think one of them is that there is been a major shift in the last couple of years away from just thinking that the solution to a lot of these problems is to focus on rural investment and on keeping people in rural areas. And I think there is now a major recognition that a lot of the focus needs to shift to urban areas. So I think that's one positive step. I think the second and more challenging issue that's now confronting those of us within the urban sector operating on the ground is that it's still very, very difficult to get these various aid organizations and the donor and the recipient governments, the borrowers, to see that there needs to be some new mechanism for passing through some of the financing to mayors, to local authorities, to local governments, with the kind of autonomy they need to make the decisions about how they allocate their resources. And we've seen a number of those programs, and I've managed a couple of those programs which have been very exciting and new, and it's very doable within the context of the current structures, but it needs the kind of political commitment both inside the donor organizations and particularly within the local within the governments themselves. So, for example, recently I know a couple of countries where there are big cities that want to receive ADB money or World Bank money, but their constraint is actually that their government itself in the country, national government, doesn't want them to interact directly or almost directly with these aid agencies. So I think that's a major area that needs a lot of push and support actually from within DFID and within other aid organizations and think tanks and policy areas. I think the other constraint, and it is an issue, is at local government level itself, where you really need to find leadership at local government who can understand these issues and who want, or they understand the issues, but who are committed to kind of the organizational reforms that are often required, that are complex and difficult. And you have to fight a lot of the corruption, a lot of the financial management and organizational and governance issues before you even come to some of the service delivery issues. I think there's another point which I've come across, which is that there's an interesting combination at these local levels of very low-cost, high-impact interventions, and I think some of them are like street addressing, some of them have to do with some of those legal citizenship issues where you can do a lot with very little money, and I think that's very exciting, but you've got to have mayors who are prepared to do some of those things. And then there are the areas, and I'll come back a little bit to asking David's question and DFID's question, which is the water and sanitation impact will require large-scale resources. I mean, we've had a number of participatory processes where you don't have to have perfect information. You go out there and you ask people in cities, if you have to choose your priority services, which are they, you will get the answers without having to have a lot of data. And in Maputo City, where I've been working most recently, water and sanitation, of course, came up in the top 3. So did things that were interesting and different, like cemeteries. Nobody's mentioned cemeteries here, but in Maputo City, 80% of graves are being exhumed to be able to bury new people. And this is a real issue in the city. You just need to ask people through a good participatory process and you get a lot of these answers. But I think in terms of the water and sanitation agenda, we came up against this real issue that because there are limited funds available for local government programs, because national governments want to deal with some national sexier issues in local government, you end up with programs that are $50 million or $100 million, and you ask people what they want. You can do 10 things for $50 million, or you can build one sewer for 150, or one solid waste landfill, etc. So there are real issues until there is much more money on the table for some of these investments, in particularly in water and sanitation and some of the other transport, roads, etc. You have to go in with from a national perspective. So that's my final point, which is I think that DFID and a lot of agencies could do so much more at a local level using national programs around, for example, water sanitation or transport. I've seen a lot of programs that are national transport programs, hundreds of millions of dollars, but the national road that goes through the city stays with the city to manage and to maintain, and doesn't get any of this money. And similarly with a lot of other things, whereas there is and public sector reform, being a municipal civil servant is not accorded the kind of respect and training and career trajectory that a national service. So all the good people want to get out of local government and go to national government. And that's a real issue that I think public sector reform programs could deal with at a national level. So there's a lot of work that can be done, I think, to move this agenda, which is key, forward.
Okay, thank you very much. It also brings to mind the discussions about institutions, the argument that in a lot of places, major growth, it will be in secondary areas, secondary cities that tend to have very weak institutions compared to big municipal areas. I'm going to go back to the panel now, and then we'll do another round after that. David, there were a number, including Kate's questions at the end, that were in your area. Would you like to start?
Okay, thank you. Well, obviously, the two critical players are local government and civil society. And civil society has to include urban poor organisations, otherwise the NGOs take over. And I mean, I know the bank and I know DFID and I know lots of agencies have been struggling with this attempt to set up funding structures for local governments. They've just got to struggle more, and it's actually got to deliver. I mean, in Latin America, you have had some municipal funds set up with external funding that have supported local governments invest. But you need the accountability and the transparency to make sure it works. There are, you know, if you go to Karachi and some of the other cities in Pakistan, you've got a fantastic model where the communities do the small pipes and the municipality does the big pipes. And they do it at a fifth of the cost of a conventional water and sanitation investment. And they can fund it with domestic resources. So there are ways of doing the big pipes, at least in countries as technically competent as Pakistan. I'm amused about the cemeteries. Of course, the cemeteries were the hot issue in every expanding European city in the 19th and early 20th century as they sought more land. I didn't want to give the impression that there aren't solutions. There's amazing solutions. You know, I've been going to Latin America every year since 1981. In 1981, everyone got bulldozed. Now when I go, municipalities do upgrading as it's just what a municipality does. You know, in Buenos Aires, there were evictions every year, terrible evictions. There's no evictions now. I've watched Latin America as they returned to democracy, as they fought for constitutional change, which guaranteed funding for local government. They fought for transparency. They fought for elected mayors. And it's produced a whole new generation in Latin America who have transformed cities. Very exciting. And even in mediocre governments, like those in much of Buenos Aires, in general, things are towards improving access to water, to sanitation, to drainage, to healthcare, legal addresses. I think my friend who wrote a book about it called it the quiet revolution. I think we need to make it a little less quiet because of the lessons we can learn from there. Final point. What's the best upgrading program I've ever seen? One that was organized and managed by women's savings groups. Thailand, the government, the national government set up a national fund on which grassroots organizations, mainly women's savings groups, could draw direct. And it gave them loans for negotiating the tenure of the land they were on, buying the land if necessary, loans for housing, loans for infrastructure, loans for livelihoods. When the squatters had negotiated tenure of the land, the government then provided water and sewers and drains and healthcare and schools. And I've been going to Bangkok, every 2-3 years for 15 years. And I go to neighborhoods which were among the worst neighborhoods I've ever been in. Now, gorgeous 3-story terraced housing. I would die to live there, usually by a canal in a wonderful location. And all of this funded by internal funds. It didn't even need any external funds. All organized and managed by women's savings groups. 400,000 people have benefited in the last 10 years. So this isn't, a little community program. No, we have the models that show us how to do things. It's just the difficulty is moving all the other governments in that direction.
Thanks, David. Claire, do you want to take up Hugh's points on MDGs?
I don't have a great deal to add except for yes. Just a couple of other things have struck me, though, in the questions. I did think on the issue of local government, obviously the problems are not nearly as acute, and it might be slightly trite to make the comparison, but I think that many people who work in local government here would recognise that sense of being, deeply undervalued and, not nearly as glamorous as your national counterparts. And I think one of the sort of inputs into local government here, of course, is your kind of very young, ambitious people who see, for example, being elected as a local councillor as the first step towards becoming an MP 10 years later. So I think, you know, as well as the sort of administrative changes that one might look for to make local governments work better, there might also be a kind of political change in the sense of integrating, of seeing local and national structures as being integrated and providing a sort of pathway for ambitious people between the two, rather than seeing local government as a sort of bit of a sort of graveyard of ambition, which is always the danger. And on funding, I think perhaps it would be inappropriate to talk about urbanisation for too long without mentioning the cable car, which I think has been it's a fantastic innovation in transport, you know, and in, I mean, I just find this incredibly interesting as a sort of very much a kind of lateral thinking type solution to a very big, expensive transport problem being solved, or not solved, but, you know, one way of helping to alleviate some of those problems being a sort of relatively low cost, low effort, in the sense of requiring not quite so much disruption of an entire area as laying a new road or digging a metro or something. So I think, you know, there are obviously, you know, absolutely these things are hugely expensive. Doing a, you know, developing a fully functioning sanitation system, a proper mass transit system, hugely expensive, very difficult. But there are, you know, other things that one can do in the meantime, some of which have a really impressive effect.
Thanks very much, Claire. Doug, do you want to?
Sure. I was quite interested in your point about energy, actually, because this is obviously one of the great barriers to progress in a lot of these places on two levels. One of which is as you say, that there's no markets created in many of these areas for energy, which as someone else suggested, tends to deprive the very poor in some ways, in a lot of ways. I find it interesting that marginal self-built communities almost always manage to get themselves electricity fairly early on by jerry-rigging it out of the utility lines. It's much more easy to do that than with water, because water tends to be a little bit more protected sometimes and so on. And what it indicates is that nobody's really paying for the electricity, and that probably nobody's really getting billed for it in many countries. And as a result, the supply of proper electricity doesn't happen. There are no incentives to provide it at low costs, so it either gets taken at no cost or not available at all. But when you certainly everywhere, the energy costs in marginal communities are many, many times higher than the wealthiest neighborhoods. I have to say that was true of London in the 19th century as well, apparently, but because you have to buy it by packaged units at a great cost. I think this is compounded by the fact that, getting back to the municipal government question, is that in a lot of marginal areas, the de facto municipal government is some sort of criminal or not quite legal body or organization that's acting as a de facto government because of the lack of any state presence other than the police that occasionally try to clear out those people. And this is certainly true in a lot of parts of the Indian subcontinent that I've seen, and in famously in a lot of parts of South America. I mean, the favelas of Rio, controlled by the drug gangs, one of the biggest problems there is that those gangs also are the sort of Tammany Hall government and the provider of gas at many times the cost and so on. And to loop the circle back to the municipal government question, the places that seem to have got out of these sort of traps are the cities that tend to have a very strong municipal government. I mean, I think the reason why the barrios and favelas of São Paulo and Bogota and Lima have improved hugely and have seen really successful upgrading programs, whereas those of let's say Rio and Caracas, a few other places have not, is entirely located in the fact that there's a mayor and possibly a municipal administration who are very active on these things. And yes, exactly. And in Rio, which is now realizing that it's facing a crisis with 2 major sporting events coming up, anything that's improved has been because of very expensive interventions from the national government that have often faced resistance and troubles from the layers of municipal government and organized crime that actually govern the neighborhood. So I think in a lot of countries, part of the problem is to develop any municipal authority at all. I think you could almost have a program to try to get countries to develop municipal anythings, because so much is controlled nationally in countries that should have city governments. Policing, I think, being the most severe thing. I think when I see surveys of needs of people in marginal urban communities, security is often at the very top of the list. And you sometimes have to interrogate exactly what they mean by that. But it's often the problem is that any security is provided by a national police force, which is usually a branch of the military in many countries, and still treats these, even if the government officially has become enlightened and is understanding the importance of upgrading these neighborhoods, the military police treat them as a threat and raid them and so on. And the few places in South America and Asia that I've seen that have developed actual municipal police forces have seen huge improvements because of that, particularly if they're somewhat self-governed by the neighborhoods that are being policed and so on. So yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to municipal government.
Doug, thank you very much. I think we are now, I know. I think we're coming up against time, but Andrew, we have one question for you that's come in from on the internet, which is why is it difficult for DFID to engage with local governments and grassroots organisations? What are the obstacles? So if I could just add that to the mix. And I won't ask you about UN Habitat. So.
Thank you. I think DFID does have a country-led approach, and part of that means engaging with the national governments. And I think we heard that the issue actually often has to be resolved within the country themselves, whether the national government has a policy towards supporting their own local government. Now, other agencies have done a lot more on decentralisation than DFID and engaged in this space a lot more. So I think there's just very little experience and knowledge about it within DFID. I actually fund one programme called SNTA, Sub-National Technical Advisory Authority, which is actually hosted by the World Bank, who help municipalities and utilities get bond finance and that kind of issue to raise finance in the open market. I tried telling people in DFID about it. Very few people understand what I'm going on about. Just we haven't engaged here at all. But the key thing is, in country, it's a matter of the country itself trying to work with them so that they recognise the importance of local government. Because if you're working on government to government, the money has to flow down through there. And our money is only a little tiny bit compared with their own resources. So if they don't get their own resources flowing to local government, there's no point the aid trickle going to local government and ignoring what they do with their own money. I think that's the crucial area that needs to be dealt with.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I know there were some other questions, but I think people who can maybe engage with the panel afterwards, because we're up against time now, so I think I will wrap up at this point. But I'd like to thank the panel very much. It was actually two quite different presentations. I think Doug's is much more optimistic in some ways, but it still coalesced around, I think, three themes. One is that we misperceive poor urban areas as social systems, that we underestimate both their problems, their poverty, and their potential, and that there is a huge problem with measures that are miscalibrated, and that unless we fix to some extent the problems with measures, we won't get very far with the goals and the targets on the MDGs element as well. But I'd like to thank everyone very much indeed, and particularly thank Claire and her team for having organised this seminar. So, Claire, would you like to say something quickly about the event on the 24th before we break?
Just the event on the 24th is going to be the next in our After 2015 series, looking at climate finance and the kind of challenges that having this new big funding stream, some of which will also go to developing countries, might throw up for donors and for others, you know, trying to sort of in parallel think about a development-focused funding stream. And then the two events after that, which you'll see on your sheets, which don't yet have dates attached, so keep an eye on the ODI website, will be one on chronic poverty and inequality, and one in May on growth and jobs. Obviously, employment issues, another big neglected area of the MDGs. And again, you know, I think in some ways the conversation might be in some degree similar to this one on a very different area. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Many thanks for your time.
there, and please take one of these pamphlets. I don't want to bicycle home with them.
Oh, yeah, we have lots of materials out of this room on the little table in the hall.